I'm going to talk briefly tonight, probably 45 minutes, about a topic we consider to be pretty important. It is why you should probably take the SAT or ACT or both. Um, I am Chris Hamilton. I'm the principal, the founder of Hamilton Education. I also have founded a couple other educational companies in California, and I taught English literature at UCLA for many years. And I edited a food and wine magazine after that and before this work. I have some opinions that I'm going to share with you. You're not obligated to adopt any of my opinions. I'd like you to consider them this evening. I think they have great bearing on the lives of the students that you've raised and whose hopes you have a great interest in. If you need to leave early, I'm going to try to summarize my message in about 2 minutes, and then I'll give you some more details. The essence of what I'm saying is 99% of the colleges and universities in the United States are going to be considering the SAT and ACT. I'm going to repeat that. 99% of the colleges and universities are considering scores. Test optional is, in the words of an Ivy League admissions director, not really an option for most students. COVID is not entirely gone, but in the minds of universities and colleges, it is over, it is done. The concerns about students being able to take the SAT or ACT or not being able to take it are out of their minds. They're not worried about that. And we'll talk today about why almost certainly most of you, if you're a student, should be taking the SAT and ACT. I'll even explain why you should probably take it, why I use that word instead of saying absolutely everyone. But the essence is there's only really one major university system in the entire United States that is not considering the SAT or ACT. It is the University of California and the Cal States system. We'll talk about what that means for admissions in those schools. Every other college or university in the United States will be considering the SAT or ACT in admissions. This is the number one reason that I think you should take the SAT or ACT. It is very useful information. Most colleges have decided. We'll even talk a little bit about this fascinating report that the UCs instituted about 2 years ago and revealed to the world in 2020. It's a report about whether the SAT is useful, whether it is fair, or whether it is discriminatory. We'll talk a little bit about what this study discovered, what it concluded. Some of you will be surprised at what its conclusions are. Almost every college other than the UCs and Cal States would like to see the SAT or ACT. If you're wondering, well, I think I might only apply to the UCs. California is lovely. Look at this beautiful May weather. Why would I leave? We'll talk about some reasons why you almost certainly want to build a strategy that involves applying to some schools outside of the UC system, perhaps even outside of California. I want to talk first about what the numbers say about test optional. This data is from a year ago, and it's only stronger now. In the midst of COVID, it was absolutely the case that many students, no matter how they prepped or how hard they tried, they couldn't get a site available to them. We had students where multiple sites canceled one date after the other. These numbers come from that period of COVID. The preliminary data suggests, again, last year, that Ivy Leagues and Stanford, 70% of the admitted students took the test and included a score. Back then, it was 30% being admitted without a test. That number is going to drop. One study found in the 2020-21 admission season that students who applied to a test optional school who submitted scores above the 25th percentile were accepted at roughly double the rate of students who applied without them. Double the rate. In fact, curiously, students who submitted scores that were not by any definition good, scores that were the 25th percentile, that means 75% of the students who submitted scores are better than you. Even those students were accepted at a rate that was 1.25 times that of students who didn't submit test scores. In other words, even fairly low scores give you a better chance than someone who doesn't submit any, because they tend to assume if you don't submit any scores, it's like an unanswered question. We kind of assume the worst. Kids who submitted test scores last year had a clear advantage. Half of Emory's applications submitted scores, Emory, the fine university in Georgia, but 68.5% of those who were admitted did. If you come from a middle-class background and have more of a prototypical profile, then you'll need to stand out. It should say in other ways, if you intend to apply test optional. Most of my students are middle class. Here's one more reason why you should probably be taking the SAT or ACT. Students who attend rigorous private or public high schools. I'm going to name a couple examples. Canyon Crest Academy, CCA, Westview, Del Norte, Torrey Pines, Mount Carmel. I could go on and on. Bishops, La Jolla Country Day, Pacific Ridge. These and many other schools are rigorous. When COVID struck, Bishops took about 2 days to build an online version of Bishops, and students were learning and being graded and evaluated all the way through. And I don't want to name names, but a particular school district did nothing for 2 months, hoping that COVID would simply come to an end. And then when the next year came around and it was clear that wouldn't be the case, students simply learned less than they had in the years before with in-person instruction. Some schools in California and across the United States, some schools had policies that we might call COVID grading. The policy was everybody gets A's, no one can fail, no one can have a grade lower than what they had before COVID. And then other high schools like CCA and Westview did not have such a policy. These rigorous schools almost certainly have resulted in more learning and more mastery of subjects than schools that didn't really teach and didn't grade and didn't evaluate. The UCs and schools that don't use the SAT, ACT, the Cal States, they can't tell the difference between a GPA that was easy to get and a GPA that was hard to get. Some of my favorite teachers at CCA, they give B's and C's to students who are extraordinary. In fact, one of my students who got into Harvard and Stanford and MIT from CCA, he got a B from a almost legendary math teacher who's one of the best you'll ever have, but one of the hardest graders. The SAT and ACT are traditionally measures of the rigor of the curriculum that you're exploring in high school. It will show what those grades mean. If you go to a weaker school and you're discovering that you really didn't learn algebra and geometry, one reason I say probably you want to take the SAT, if you go to a weaker school, the test may reveal that your GPA is really not quite the same GPA as others. But if you go to any of those high schools I named or others around the country, you can only gain by showing in an objective way that your GPA and your classes really have established rigor and mastery. Most selective colleges and universities will secretly admit that test optional isn't really an option for most students. This is another reason I'd like you to consider taking the SAT or ACT. One admissions director for an Ivy League school, he's asked that I not name him, so I will not name him. At the very beginning of COVID, he said, okay, we're gonna go test optional because we're worried that students may not be able to take the SAT or ACT very easily in the midst of COVID. That turned out to be a very prescient, foresighted, accurate worry. He also said, though, because he didn't want to be quoted, he was very candid. He said, if you're middle class and you go to a good school, you should submit scores. He said, if you're white or you're Asian, we absolutely want to see those scores. We expect them to be good. He named a few instances where maybe people wouldn't submit scores. If you live on an Indian reservation in Wyoming, this particular Ivy League would be fine not having to see scores. They're going to dig into that student much more deeply anyway, talk to teachers, maybe even fly the student out. If I have any students who are on Indian reservations in Wyoming, I'm not aware of it. Carmel Valley, Rancho Penasquitos, those are very different situations. Why would colleges lie to us? Why would colleges mislead us? There are some colleges that have said that it doesn't matter. We're going to consider students equally, whether they submit or do not submit scores. Well, there's a number of reasons why they would lie to us. Let's first establish that colleges unfortunately do lie to their applicants and the public. I'm sharing with you something I grabbed from the bot at UC Irvine that answers questions about admission. So this is Peter the Anteater. And I've asked Peter the Anteater, which majors are impacted? Most of you would think, oh, well, impacted majors are these majors that are very, very popular. They often are pre-professionals, such that you graduate with a very valuable set of skills out into the job market. Things like engineering, computer science, nursing, these are certainly impacted majors. Let's take a look at what UC Irvine says when we ask this very straightforward question. Good news, UCI says. UCI doesn't have any impacted majors. Nursing, computer science, and business administration are the most highly selected majors. The average freshman retention rate, an indicator of student satisfaction, is 93%. This is what we call in English literature a non sequitur. This is not logically related to the question. And then they give you a list of majors that you can check out, which, by the way, is a pretty solid list of the most impacted majors at UC Irvine: nursing, business, computer science, and engineering. How do I know that UC Irvine is lying essentially to the public? Well, common sense is one way, but I know someone who was a UC Irvine admissions reader this year, and this person told me in their training, they were told to expressly look into certain majors because they were impacted. They're much harder to get into. Why would UC Irvine mislead the public and the applicants? Almost certainly because UC Irvine wants more applicants. More applicants means the university is more selective. Almost every admissions professional is judged by certain metrics, which is ironic. They are going to be judged by certain metrics, certain objective data. They're not so confident they want other people to be judged in that way. They want to judge based on their personal impression, but they want to be evaluated by objective data, like how many more students applied to UC Irvine. That makes UC Irvine seem more attractive. And if UC Irvine is more selective, if they reject more people, UC Irvine becomes a better university in the US News ranking. So in fact, all the UCs almost instantly, even though it's very likely that the freshman class next year may present certain challenges for the UCs, it may be very likely the least well-prepared freshman class they have assembled. On paper, the UCs are going to be better because in eliminating the SAT and ACT, the UCs sent a message worldwide that anyone could or should apply to the UCs. And in fact, when the message is that anyone could possibly get into Berkeley, the fact is everyone applies. Berkeley went from 89,000 applicants just 2 years ago to 150,000 applicants. My advice is to not take colleges, strictly speaking, at their word. A Harvard admissions person once said in writing that the idea that Harvard practiced race-based admissions wasn't unfair in any sense, because no one no one was disadvantaged by their policy. It could only advantage other students. You only need to think about that for one moment to realize, in a zero-sum game where there's only 1,651 students typically in the freshman class at Harvard, advantages to some that others don't have are disadvantages, certainly by the very definition. Another reason I'd like you to take the SAT and ACT is that the SAT and ACT, and particularly the PSAT, which is just a shorter version of the SAT, they're important factors for merit scholarships. USC uses the 11th grade PSAT, and other universities do as well, as the primary factor in awarding their prestigious presidential and trustee scholarships. They're worth as much as $230,000 at USC, and almost every year we have at least one, and sometimes more than one, students who will earn that award. It's not always understood fully that the UCs, even now, use the SAT and ACT for placement, and they use them for admitting foreign students when they're less confident about what a grade point or grading system would mean in different countries. Let's put aside the fact that every university system other than the UCs are interested in your SAT or ACT score. They're interested also because it can earn you money. With the UCs and Cal States considering only GPA, although essays also matter, you should know some UC readers, in fact, the person I was alluding to shared with me that the UC admissions officer who did the training of the Army part-time admissions readers, that person acknowledged that he spends 3 to 4 minutes typically reviewing an entire UC application. I want you to consider that is 4 essays, possibly a 5th, 20 detailed descriptions of activities, a transcript, the survey of majors and alternate majors. This material would take most human beings reading at a pretty fast clip, a minimum of 10 to 15 minutes. It's impossible to read more than 2,000 words in 3 to 4 minutes. You can skim them. The UC admission system is deeply problematic because they left behind a holistic admission system that would look at a number of factors and have moved toward one that looks at one factor, GPA, and whatever they can glean from a quick scanning of your essays. Essays that students spend weeks, sometimes months, crafting. They'll be reviewed in the length of a commercial break during the Super Bowl. The idea that the UCs would spend so little time on so much writing, it's beyond speed reading. It reminds me of a joke Woody Allen told in the 70s about taking a speed reading course. He said that he learned to read Tolstoy's War and Peace in 10 minutes. And then he says, it's about Russia. That's about all you get if you glance through War and Peace in 10 minutes. And I've got some pretty strong evidence that that's about all the UC readers are getting about your student, about your applicant. And I'm gonna give you some examples of why I want you to consider the UC admissions in its current form to be more like a lottery than a merit-driven system. I'm going to have you consider 2 actual students. These are not hypothetical. These are real students. I will leave them unnamed. They are from the same San Diego high school. One, we're going to call this person student one, has a weighted GPA of 3.6 at a competitive high school. She has several C's and quite a few B's. She has very few formal activities and very little leadership. She speaks Ukrainian and Russian better than English. SAT, ACT scores were low, but the UCs don't need to know that. She works at Starbucks. I gotta add, she's a charming, wonderful person who has talents and skills and potential. Absolutely, potential. This is another student. This student has a weighted GPA of 4.43 at the same high school. He has taken probably 16, 18, maybe even 20 APs. He has all A's and a perfect ACT score and a perfect PSAT score. He won a first grand award at ISEF in his category. This student built a machine learning tool to help with cancer diagnostics. This award is something that only a handful of people in the entire world competing against the entire world would win, although frankly, CCA has more than its fair share of them. This student also troubled by the fact that bioengineering and bioinformatics were pretty common areas to explore in high school if you live in San Diego. He was troubled by the fact that elsewhere in the world, in the United States, they're not common things that you could study. He built a nonprofit that taught for free these kinds of resources. And he's worked with more than 5,000 students around the world. Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO, heard about this student and on Good Morning America awarded him impressive scholarship along with 13 other teenagers who were impressive in other ways. Both of these students are valuable human beings with who knows what potential, certainly lots of potential. But I'm going to tell you, student one was accepted to UCLA. Student two was not accepted to UCLA or Berkeley, but in fact was waitlisted this year at UC Irvine or UC Davis, was rejected, not waitlisted, rejected by UC Santa Barbara, and the backups that he chose, San Jose State, Cal Poly SLO, also rejected from those. Before you shed tears, hopefully you gasped a little bit. Before you shed tears, he was accepted to Stanford. He applied early, was accepted to MIT in March, and then was accepted to Harvard and Yale and Princeton. I advised him to only apply to those private schools because he got into Stanford early, and it felt greedy to apply to a wide range of private schools just to brag about how many you got into. He's a gracious, thoughtful, generous-hearted person. Student number two. Some people might be thinking now, some people have said to me, Mr. Hamilton, I mean, this student number two kid, he's surely overqualified for the UCs. No, he's not overqualified. No one is overqualified for Berkeley computer science. Berkeley is ranked in the world pretty much number 2 in computer science, tied with Stanford. MIT is above. Stanford and MIT also said yes, so apparently he's not overqualified for those. No one is overqualified for Berkeley in any field of endeavor. Chemistry, there's an element on the periodic table called berkelium. There is no element called Princetonium or Harvardium. Berkeley is the dominating force in chemistry. It has been for 100 years. UCLA is a highly desirable university. He was not overqualified for the UCs. He was overlooked. He was overlooked because Berkeley had 150,000 applications, and They didn't see his scores. They almost certainly didn't really absorb all the things that he had done. They looked at his GPA. It looked great, but it didn't look any better than the 50,000 other students who have a perfect GPA. What I saw this year and last year is if you have a not perfect GPA and you are middle class and go to a good school, you got a really tough road for the UCs. I ask you to consider what you have seen and heard this year in terms of your friends and neighbors and their acceptances, or in most cases, rejections from the state system that your taxes support. Um, the UCs have sought to reinvent their admissions, and I'm going to make the argument at the end of this presentation that they're doing so in contradiction to their own research and study, even in contradiction to 99% of the professors who teach in the UC system. And they're doing so, I would argue, in contradiction of two voter propositions that are black letter law in California. We'll talk about why that matters in a little bit. What lessons can we take from the fact that this student, who's one of the strongest I've ever seen, got into every Ivy League and schools like MIT and Stanford and was almost universally shut out of the UCs? The lesson is, do not tell yourself that you are aiming, just for the UCs or only the UCs. Once a week, I hear a smart teenager say that, oh, I don't want the Ivies, just the UCs. No one, not even the sort of student accepted to Harvard, Stanford, and MIT, is likely to get into the UCs now. Most of us think in terms of merit when it comes to college admissions, but traditional notions of merit are pretty much out the window at the UCs. Let me say that again. It's most of you, if your parents are gonna have a hard time getting beyond the idea that, but these things should matter. Look at all the work my student did. Look at the qualifications. Look at these accomplishments. The UCs are seeing traditional notions of merit as simply evidence of privilege or through a racial lens where they think, well, that's just how you people are. And if you wonder why I would say that, listen to the words of the San Diego school district's, well, we'll see if she'll continue to be the superintendent, but look at those sentiments and listen to those words where this person is certain that she can dismiss the accomplishments and even the dreams of a giant chunk of students living in San Diego. The UCs are absolutely on board with that kind of dismissal of a whole category of student and human being. Maybe the most important reason you almost certainly should be taking the SAT or ACT isn't just the test optional colleges really want the scores, and it isn't just for scholarships and merit awards. It isn't just to show the rigor of your school. It's the fact that MIT recently announced just last month in a blog post that they are going to reinstitute mandatory SAT and ACT. Very likely there will be other colleges that follow their lead. This is just the headline of the MIT blog. I'm going to summarize a little bit of it. It says, we are reinstating our SAT, ACT requirement for future admissions cycles. And the bulk of the article talks about the fact that the SAT and ACT, for reasons that they admit are hard to fully grasp, actually improve the diversity of the freshman class at MIT. The SAT and ACT are not only helpful in determining who will thrive at MIT, they're also helpful in identifying talent and ability that would otherwise be missed, talent and ability that might represent diversity, ethnic diversity, diversity across gender. This was surprising to some people. It's not surprising to anyone who read this 200-page report produced by the UCs. The UCs in 2018 commissioned a report to examine the viability of the SAT and ACT. The question was, is it useful? Does it tell us something meaningful? Is it fair? Or is it discriminatory based on race or gender? I imagine some of you think you know what this study concluded, because you know what the UCs ultimately decided to do regarding the SAT or ACT. But this study actually concluded that the SAT and ACT are extraordinarily fair, that they are incredibly useful at predicting future success, more useful than grades alone, much more useful, and that eliminating the tests would be a serious problem. There are too many students who have perfect grades. This was even before COVID, when we saw almost 2 years of some high schools giving A's automatically and other high schools awarding traditional rigorous grades. The SAT and ACT, according to the UC study, which the MIT blog post quotes extensively, this study strongly advocates for using the SAT and ACT. It seems that the only people who didn't read the study would be the UC regents, who voted to go test optional. And I should explain something about that. You may forget, possibly, that the UC regents back in 2020 voted to make the SAT, ACT optional. It was a year later, a legal case brought before a judge in Alameda that argued that the SAT should be eliminated. The argument went like this: if the test is optional, it will be an incredible advantage to students who can submit scores, who can submit good scores. So, Your Honor, the advocacy groups argued it would be unfair to have test optional. You should eliminate the test because people who submit scores will be at an advantage. And the judge decided, yes, it would be an incredible advantage to submit scores. So I'm granting your request that there be no consideration of the SAT or ACT. It would advantage those students who could submit scores. My advice to you is to take advantage of that advantage. If you go to a good high school, a rigorous high school, even without studying, you'll probably have a stronger SAT or ACT score than most students in the United States. And in our experience in the last 8 years, 40% of our students from summer classes end up with SAT, ACTs in the top 1%. In fact, 10% typically get perfect scores, which are supposed to be 1/100th of 1%. Perfect scores do not guarantee you get into your dream college. I admit they're probably a little better for me than for you. I can put your initials on this list of kids who are perfect, but they won't hurt you, and they may make a tremendous difference, especially the further you get from current admissions wisdom, a word I use advisedly. In other words, if you're applying to Oxford or Cambridge or other universities, they do find themselves impressed with perfect scores. I couldn't say it better than this judge in Alameda. The SAT or ACT, if you could submit it, it would absolutely be an advantage. I'm going to talk a little briefly about a larger issue. I hope I won't step on anyone's toes. We're in a moment now where we're contemplating as Americans, how are we going to build a system of admission that is fair? And I am someone who has long advocated that a holistic admissions process that looks at every factor, including disadvantages, would be better than one that's strictly test-based. I don't want to sound like a hypocrite, but I spent many years teaching at UCLA. I've been fairly left-leaning most of my life, and I think there's more to students than a score. In fact, the tagline of Hamilton Education is quite literally more than a score. But I've also been very troubled by what I guess I can only describe as elements of racism that make assumptions about some of my students, particularly Asian American students. As I suggested, the superintendent of a significant school district in San Diego recently dismissed the accomplishments of Asian Americans. She claimed Asian American students, Chinese students, they're all millionaires, so of course they have advantages. I don't need to tell the people on this Zoom call that's just strictly speaking not true at all. The UCs actually contemplated using a workaround from the two voter propositions, Prop 209 in 1996 and Prop 16 in 2020, the two voter propositions that prevented them from using race or gender-based admissions. They contemplated using income, using poverty as factors advantaging or weighting certain student applications. But what they discovered was that won't fix their problem. Their problem is too many Asian students in the top UCs. What that means is there are too many Asian American students who are poor. When I watch national news stories that show some deranged individual shooting women, mostly Asian American women, in a massage parlor, that may be an example of a hate crime. To me, it's an example of the fact that Asian American families in the United States are not all millionaires. Many work blue collar working class jobs. Many families I've known came to the United States with $40 because that's all they were allowed to take with them. Many families I've known came on boats and lost some of their family members leaving Vietnam. I would encourage you to take the SAT and ACT because it can demonstrate to colleges a lot more than your GPA can. And if you go to a really tough school, your GPA may have a couple bobbles and slips that your testing can balance out and address. But I would also urge you to keep in mind this group of Americans, Asian Americans, that the UCs so desperately want fewer of. In fact, Janet Napolitano, the former president of the UCs, who really put this in place, she said, we want to change the racial dynamics of the UCs. She said this openly. But if you want fewer, if you want more of one group, you want fewer of another. And the group she wants fewer of, I mean, I can't see who's on this Zoom call, but the group she wants fewer of is probably your students and your family. Whether a public university system should have that as its goal, I suppose, is a matter of debate. But in my mind, there's little debate that that sentiment violates the spirit and very likely the law of Prop 209 and Prop 16, which says you are not supposed to admit in California, in the UCs and Cal States, based on race and gender. What we're seeing in the UCs is a striking example of what in the United States we used to call redlining. It was a shameful practice of indirect racism, subtle, sneaky laws to keep certain people, back then, Jewish people, African-American families, out of certain neighborhoods. The UCs have purposefully created a change in their admissions such that it's now nearly a lottery, which will give them a similar composition to the racial composition of California. And I would, as a person who's somewhat left-leaning, would acknowledge there are advantages to diversity. There's more than just a score, but the idea that in California, of all places, a state that put some of its Asian American citizens in what are effectively concentration camps. If you drive up the 5 and go to Mammoth to go snowboarding, you can't help but notice the guard tower still standing in the high desert. You may not know that if you are Asian, you were not allowed to immigrate to the United States until 1965, because until that date, it was understood that you were racially undesirable. I would encourage you to think about those things and maybe even write about some of those things to your elected officials or your school board, because I believe in what a famous psychologist, Dworkin, calls the growth model, that individuals can thrive and grow. I believe that students can work hard and learn new skills. I don't believe we should be judging anyone by accidents of their birth or their heritage. If that is wrong, it's wrong. And it is a serious concern about whether the people who pay their taxes in California and students who contribute extraordinary things will have a chance to continue contributing extraordinary things. As you may have heard, the UCs have already floated the notion that they'd like to get rid of all grades for the first year, the freshman year of college. You don't have to be a detective to figure out why they're probably interested in doing that. They're anxious that the group they've assembled with these new admissions policies are not up to the task of doing the work at the UCs. Because I spent so many years teaching English at UCLA, I can tell you, sometimes that happens. I would strongly urge you to show colleges around the country, not just California, some of what you've accomplished or achieved in your various classes. Your grades are one way of doing that, but if you go to a rigorous high school, they may not be the only way or even the best way. I believe in holistic admission, something that sees the whole person and many three-dimensional pieces of who you are. Don't keep the piece, the SAT or ACT, that can show objectively some of your talents. Don't keep it in a drawer. Send it off to colleges. We're happy to talk with people about how to prepare for these tests if that's something you're interested in. Several years ago, Huffington Post said that we're perhaps the best prep testing program in the country. We're proud of that. We're not the best for everyone. We're really best for motivated students who really want to learn skills. I'm happy to tell you this year, 30% of the students, might be more than that, accepted to MIT in San Diego County were our students. We had 7 kids get into Stanford this year. In 2020, 30% of the students in Southern California counties accepted to Harvard or Hamilton students. We do 2 things. We help people learn skills, such as those on the SAT and ACT, and we help students explain who they are to colleges and universities in the form of college consulting and essay consulting. Let us know if we can help you with either, but help yourself by sending in scores to colleges and universities if you're applying next year. Thank you for taking 45 minutes out of your Thursday evening. I appreciate your time and your attention. Please give the office a call or send an email if you have any questions for me, or you want to argue some of these points with me. I will listen. Thank you. I am going to wish you all well, and pleasant evening.